If you've watched Game of Thrones, you know what the Red Wedding is. You know the feeling of watching guests sit down to a feast, relaxed, safe, and then realizing, too late, that the hospitality is a trap. George R.R. Martin has said publicly that the Red Wedding was inspired by two real historical events. One of them happened in Scotland, in a castle that still stands today. The year is 1440, the place is Edinburgh Castle, and the guests of honor are two teenage brothers, William and David Douglas. The king is 10 years old, his name is James II, and he has no idea what is about to happen at his own table. And then a servant carries in the next course and sets it on the table in front of them. It is the severed head of a black bull. In medieval Scotland, the black bull's head on the table meant one thing and one thing only: you are going to die tonight. William and David Douglas were taken to the castle courtyard, given a mock trial that lasts minutes. Edinburgh Castle sits on top of an ancient volcanic plug called Castle Rock, a mass of hard basalt that juts from the surrounding landscape like a fist. The rock is sheer on three sides. The only practical approach is from the east, along the ridge that became the Royal Mile. It is, geologically and strategically, one of the most naturally defensible positions in all of Britain. People have lived on this rock for at least 3,000 years. Iron Age settlements, Roman-era fortifications. By the early medieval period, it was already a seat of royal power. The oldest surviving building on the rock, St. Margaret's Chapel, dates to around 1130. It is tiny, barely bigger than a garden shed, and it has outlasted everything around it. What makes Edinburgh Castle different from almost any other castle in Europe is this: it was never abandoned. It has been continuously occupied as a royal residence, a military garrison, a prison, an armory, from the early medieval period to the present day. The British Army still has a garrison here. The Scottish crown jewels are kept here. The 1 o'clock gun fires from its battlements every single day. It is a living castle. And because of that, it has accumulated more history, more violence, more death, more concentrated human suffering. Every era left something behind. The medieval period left the Black Dinner. The Reformation left the witch burnings. The wars of the 17th century left the dungeons full. The Napoleonic Wars left prisoners who carved their names into the stone walls. They are all still here, and almost none of those things were comfortable. Let's go back to 1440, because the Black Dinner deserves to be told properly. The Douglases were, by the mid-15th century, probably the most powerful noble family in Scotland. They controlled vast territories and rivaled the crown itself. This was a problem for Chancellor Sir William Crichton and the King's Guardian, Sir Alexander Livingston. They were political operators who had clawed their way to power. So they made a plan. And their plan was elegant in a deeply horrible way. Instead of going to war, they would simply invite the young Earl to dinner. William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas, was about 16 years old. His brother David was younger. They were promised safe conduct. They had no reason to be afraid. The dinner began normally. The food was served, the wine flowed, and then, at some point during the meal, the black bull's head was brought to the table. Every person in that room understood immediately what it meant. It was a public announcement. You are already dead. The only thing left is the formality. The young king understood. He reportedly shouted at Crichton and Livingston. He begged. He wept openly. He was the King of Scotland, and he was the only person in that castle who had no power at all. William and David Douglas were dragged to the courtyard and beheaded on the spot. Their bodies were left in the courtyard. What followed was years of violent conflict. As for James II, the traumatized 10-year-old, he grew up to be a king with a deep, personal hatred. He eventually lured another Douglas Earl to a meeting and stabbed him to death personally. And George R.R. Martin, sitting down to write The Red Wedding centuries later, drew on this story. The history was compelling enough that it needed almost no embellishment. Walk out of Edinburgh Castle onto the esplanade and look to your left. Set into the wall of the castle rock is a small decorative fountain. Easy to miss. It's called the Witch's Well. and it marks the spot where, between roughly 1479 and 1722, more than 300 people were burned at the stake. Per capita, relative to its population, Scotland executed more people for witchcraft than almost any other country in Europe. The majority were women. The majority were burned alive. These were not the work of hysterical mobs. They were legal proceedings, conducted by courts, with judges, with lawyers, with evidence, such as it was. King James VI of Scotland was personally, obsessively interested in witchcraft. He attended torture sessions. He interrogated suspects personally. He wrote a book called Demonology. When Shakespeare wrote Macbeth specifically for the Scottish King's Court, those three witches on the heath were a direct appeal to James's obsession. The North Berwick witch trials involved dozens of accused people being tortured into confessing that they had met the devil and conjured storms to sink the king's ship. The confessions were obtained by crushing suspects' fingers in a device called the pillywinks and by a technique called pricking, inserting long needles into the skin. The people who confessed to these things didn't confess because they were witches. They confessed because the pain had become unbearable. The fountain at the castle esplanade is a late Victorian addition. Its inscription reads that it commemorates those who died for their belief, which is a generous framing. Edinburgh Castle has been besieged, captured, retaken, bombarded, and fought over more times than almost any other fortress in Britain. It is essentially a condensed history of Scottish warfare. In 1296, Edward the Fian of England, known as the Hammer of the Scots, arrived with his army and took the castle in 3 days. 3 days for a supposedly impregnable fortress. He carried off the Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, to Westminster Abbey, where it stayed for the next 700 years. In 1314, Sir Thomas Randolph, a commander of Robert the Bruce, retook the castle. He led 30 men up the sheer north face of Castle Rock in the dark. The cliff that everyone agreed was unclimbable. They climbed it at night, surprised the English guards at the top, and took the castle before anyone fully understood what was happening. Robert the Bruce, characteristically, immediately ordered the castle demolished. His strategic doctrine was simple. If you can't hold a castle permanently, destroy it so your enemy can't use it either. The long siege of 1571 to 1573 was arguably the most destructive episode. Scotland was in the middle of a civil war, Protestant forces against Catholic forces. In the end, the English sent artillery, heavy siege guns that battered the castle's walls day after day for 2 weeks. The famous David's Tower, the great medieval keep that had stood for over a century, was reduced to rubble. It wasn't excavated and rediscovered until 1912. Beneath Edinburgh Castle, cut into the rock itself, are a series of vaults. Low, dark, cold rooms that have been used for storage, as an armory, and for the better part of 3 centuries as a prison. The most remarkable thing about these vaults is the walls. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Edinburgh Castle held prisoners from the Napoleonic Wars, French soldiers and sailors captured at sea or on the battlefield and transported to Scotland. Into the stone walls of their cells, French prisoners of war scratched their names, their hometowns, the dates of their capture, and the names of the ships they served on. They carved ships in full sail. They carved portraits. They carved playing cards and game boards. One man carved an entire elaborate scene that must have taken weeks of patient work. These carvings are still there. You can stand in front of them and read names that were scratched into stone by hands that have been dust for 200 years. Proof that they existed. Some of them died here. The conditions in the vaults were harsh, cold, damp, overcrowded. Illness moved through the prisoner population regularly. There is a small burial ground near the castle where some of the Napoleonic prisoners were interred. They never went home. Their names are still on the walls. Edinburgh Castle also held at various points political prisoners, Scottish nobles, Catholic priests, Jacobite supporters. The vaults were an equalizer. Whatever your rank or religion outside, in here you were just a body in the dark. Edinburgh Castle is one of the most investigated paranormal locations in the world. In 2001, a team from Coventry University conducted the largest controlled study of paranormal phenomena ever undertaken. Over 200 volunteers were sent into the vaults. Some were told specific rooms were haunted, and some were told nothing. The results were genuinely interesting. Significant numbers of participants reported unusual experiences, seeing shapes, feeling presences, experiencing sudden drops in temperature. People reported experiences consistently across specific areas. The most frequently reported ghost is a drummer boy, a young soldier who was sent to explore the tunnels and never came back. His drumming is reportedly still heard by some visitors today. There are also multiple reports of a figure that people describe not as frightening exactly, but as deeply, profoundly sad. Grief and despair tend to accumulate in enclosed spaces. The dog cemetery near the castle entrance is one of the stranger details. Officers' dogs were buried here with markers. Some of the prisoners in the vaults beneath them did not get markers. Edinburgh Castle has been many things: a palace, a site of shock, a place of trial, a prison, and a fortress. What makes it different is that it never stopped being used. History has a habit of being buried. Edinburgh Castle's habit is to build straight over the top of it and carry on.